In this film, I'm going to look at the SHARE model. I was involved in developing SHARE with two fabulous colleagues, Joe Finch and Prospero Teddem. Originally, we developed the model as a model for assessment. But since then, we have developed it, and the people who've used it have developed it so significantly that we're now at a point where we're saying, show us anything in social work and we'll show you how you can share it. So the word share in itself is obviously very important because of all of the different things that share means to us in our society. But actually, share spells out 5 separate but interconnecting components. The S stands for seeing, the H is for hearing, the A is for action, the R for reading, and the E for evaluation. So it spells out the word share. Each of those components is separate but connects together. So I want you to imagine it like this. Imagine you're doing an assessment. Sometimes when I work with students, they'll say to me, I've never done an assessment before. What they mean is I've never filled one of those forms in before. But the form isn't the assessment. The documentation is the outcome of the assessment. In social work, your assessment draws on your share. So when you go out to see somebody, think about what do you actually see when you go into a home? What do you see? Use your observation skills. Think about what you've heard, both in conversation with the person that you're doing the assessment with, but also from other people. So maybe from family members, from other professionals. What have you heard? What action have you taken? What have you read? And then you put all of that together and you evaluate it. So what have you seen and what have you heard? Do they complement each other or do they conflict with each other? Sometimes someone will say to you, I'm managing fine, thank you very much. But actually what you see in their home environment indicates perhaps they're not managing so well. So what you see and what you hear there is contradicting each other. You take all of that into account in your evaluation, and then it becomes shared because it helps you thinking through your share, thinking through what have you seen, what have you heard, what have you done, what have you read, how do you evaluate all of that, helps you to create a defensible decision. And through that, your share becomes shared. That's a very simple way of thinking about share. But one of the key aspects of the share model is a recognition that we don't all have the same share. So two social workers could go out to see the same family and come away with a completely different view of what's going on and reach a completely different decision. And it's because maybe one of them has seen something the other one hasn't seen, or perhaps one of them has read some research that the other one hasn't read. So their share is going to be different. The model, therefore, recognises that every stakeholder in any situation has a different share. But the key thing is that as a model, it can really help you to develop aspects of empathy and understanding. So think through from the other person's perspective, what's their share? You're going out to do an assessment of somebody. You've thought through what you've seen, what you've heard, what you've done, what you've read, and how you evaluate it. But what does that other person, the person being assessed, see in you? And how do you know that? How do you know how they view you? When I was a very newly qualified social worker, I looked very young and I was going out to see families and they would say, get lost, don't come here telling me how to bring my kids up. You're a bit of a kid yourself. You haven't got a kid, don't tell me how to bring mine up. Now, I did have a child, but I looked very young and there was assumptions being made about that. Now, I could go and see the same families now and they wouldn't say, get lost, you're a bit of a kid anymore. I see myself as the same person. But you need to be very clear about how you are seen by the people that you go to visit and support. Think about the kind of language that you use when you're doing an assessment. What does that person hear from you? So if you're talking about contact instead of family time, or if you're talking about feeding instead of eating, think about the language that you're using and how negatively that can be seen and heard. Think about if the person that you're working with, if they read what you have written about them, how would that leave them feeling? For myself, I usually change the E when I'm thinking about a service user's share. I usually change that E to emotions. How will what they see, what they hear from me, what they read if I've written about them, how will that leave them feeling? And then if you've been listening carefully, you'll notice there's been no A so far in the service user's share. So what the person sees and hears and reads and how I leave them feeling will lead to their future actions. If you want to create change for people, then you need to think about their actions are created by what they see and hear from you, by what they read and how you leave them feeling. That creates a person's actions. The A sits right at the heart of share because share is all about action. So that's quite a simple way of thinking about share. What's my share? What's the other person's share? And it can work really well. But share can be used in so many ways. It's such a valuable model. So I've literally 2 days ago just marked a really good assignment from a new practice educator who was required to write about working with a student. And she used share to work through her assignment. She talked about what she'd seen from the student, what she'd heard from the student, what she did to support the student, what she'd read of the student's work and how she'd fed back about that, how she evaluated the student's practice and how that helped her to reach a decision which she could then share with the student. It was a really good piece of work. It was so well structured because it had that background model. This morning, I've seen pictures of social work students in the United Arab Emirates using share as a model for a group presentation. It looked like a brilliant group presentation, some of the photographs that I saw of that presentation. Share is a great model to use for a whole range of things. So if you want to write an assignment about your placement, think through what have you seen, what have you heard, what have you done, what have you read, how do you evaluate it? If you're writing about a critical incident, think about your share. One thing to remember about share is it doesn't have to come in a particular order. As a student, you might receive a referral. The first thing you'll do is you'll read it. Straight away, you evaluate what you think's going on in that situation. But when you go out to see the person, you change your evaluation. Actually, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. Then when you hear from them, you change it again. So the share can go backwards and forwards. It's not a process model. This is a component model. And it's a really good model for helping you to analyse situations. Try and think about your share. There is a book about share, which is, it goes through every single component. It goes through what we see in social work and hear in social work, what we do in social work. I think one of the great aspects of the book about share is that many people who have a stake in good social work provision shared their experiences. So in here you will find stories from social workers, from principal social workers, from service users, from a journalist, from all kinds of people with a different view about social work. So a share is not just about your share, it's about what you share with others. As a practice educator, I provide the students that I work with a grid like this. It helps them to think through their decision making. So when you're analysing a situation, these questions can help you. In terms of seeing, think through what have you seen, but equally, what haven't you seen? What might you have lost sight of? How would you describe your vision in terms of this situation? What does a good outcome look like in the situation that you're thinking about? And then we move on to hearing. Think through what have you heard? Who have you heard those things from? What haven't you heard? Whose voice is having the most impact on your thinking, and why is that? And do you think that you've fully heard from all of the key stakeholders? As we move into action, think about what you've done and what impact has that had on the situation. What have other people done and what impact has that had? And then think about what hasn't been done before you move to reaching your decision. As we go on to reading, think about what you've read. Now, that might be as basic as, have you read the previous case notes on this situation? Have you read any other professionals' reports? Perhaps there's a specialist assessment on file. Have you read that? But think more widely. Is there any research that you've read? Is there anything that you've read connected with your university learning that could be helpful here? Any theory, any legislation that you might be able to draw on? Then we move into evaluating things. How are you evaluating what you've seen and heard and done and read? What's important and what isn't important? In the E, always think about emotions. How do you feel about the evidence that you've gathered? How do you feel about what's going on? And what impact do those feelings have? What's worked well for you and what hasn't worked well? What are the facts in this situation and how do you know that they are facts? When you've done the seeing, the hearing, the action, the reading and the evaluation, your share can become shared. Think through, what decision have you reached and why have you reached that decision? How do you need to take that forward? And when will you review the impact of your decision? Thinking through all of these questions can help you in any situation. There are so many uses of share. If people find it helpful and would like me to talk it through, then I can produce some other films that talk about how you might think through share in your portfolio, how you might think about share in an assignment. But I'll just leave you with this little share. Think about the global pandemic at the moment. We're all locked down. What are we seeing? Are you actually watching the news or are you looking for the good stories? What are we hearing about this pandemic? What are we reading about it? How do we evaluate it? And what does that mean in terms of our actions for the future? Share can provide a really useful framework to analyse absolutely anything. Go ahead and give it a go.